Relay connection established. Origin unknown. Verification impossible. Archive access granted. Proceeding with recovered transmission. Designation, Ninth Relay.
The news reports focused on the usual arguments. Another funding deadline was approaching. Congress was debating another continuing resolution, and every network carried the same graphics showing countdown clocks, budget figures, and speculation about whether the government would remain open. Like most people, I barely paid attention. I had worked as a budget analyst on Capitol Hill for nearly 11 years, and after watching enough funding deadlines come and go, they began to feel less like historic events and more like the changing of the seasons. The headlines changed. The speeches changed. The numbers changed. The process never really did. My job was not political. I was not an advisor, a lobbyist, or anyone whose name would ever appear in the news. I worked in one of the quiet offices where staff compared appropriations from previous years against the newest drafts, making sure agencies received what Congress actually intended. Most of the work involved spreadsheets, archive bills, and requests from committee staff who needed answers before hearings began. It was tedious, repetitive, and until recently, completely uneventful. 3 weeks before the funding deadline, while comparing the latest draft of the continuing resolution against prior appropriations, I noticed a discrepancy. Buried deep within hundreds of pages of funding tables was a small administrative appropriation that was not assigned to any recognizable department. That was not entirely unusual. Agencies reorganized constantly, offices changed names, and budget codes sometimes lingered long after programs disappeared. I expected to trace the appropriation back 5 or 10 years before finding the paperwork that explained its origin. Instead, I found the exact same line item in the previous year's continuing resolution. Then the year before that, then another. The amount changed slightly every few years to account for inflation, but the wording never did. Administrative Operations, Office 7. There was no description, no committee note, no public report, and no explanation beyond a modest appropriation sufficient to maintain a small federal office. Assuming the office had simply been renamed over the decades, I searched every internal directory I could access. Nothing appeared. I checked archived organizational charts, payroll systems, federal property records, procurement databases, and agency indexes. Office 7 did not exist anywhere in the federal government. Budget codes sometimes survived after programs disappeared, but they almost always accumulated notes explaining where the money had gone or why the program had ended. Office 7 never had. It simply continued, year after year, hidden beneath thousands of pages of appropriations that almost no one ever read from beginning to end. Curiosity became obsession. I began requesting older appropriations from the archives. The office appeared in the 1990s, then the 1980s, then the 1970s. It appeared under Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, during wars and recessions, during economic booms and periods of relative peace. Every administration funded Office 7 without explanation. Eventually, I traced the appropriation into the early 1930s, when the federal accounting system had been completely different. Even then, Office 7 remained. The budget code changed to match the older format, but the office itself did not disappear. It simply adapted, quietly surviving every reform, merger, reorganization, and change in leadership. The oldest appropriations volume available to me dated to 1927. When the archivist wheeled the heavy leather-bound book into the reading room, he frowned after reading my request slip. He said he had never seen anyone ask for that volume before. I asked what made it different. He hesitated, before replying that it was not different at all, then turned and walked away before I could ask another question. 15 minutes later, I found Office 7 exactly where I expected it to be. As I closed the volume, Something slipped from between two pages and landed on the table. It was not attached to the document. Someone had deliberately hidden it there years earlier. It was an old yellowing index card with a single sentence typed neatly across its center. It read, "Do not ask what Office 7 does. Ask why every administration refuses to close it." I should have turned the card over to the archivist. Instead, I slipped it into my briefcase. The following week, I began searching for supporting documentation. Every appropriation is supposed to leave a paper trail. Even classified programs have authorizations, internal memoranda, property records, or procurement files. Money always leaves evidence behind. Office 7 did not. The appropriation existed. The budget code existed. The payments existed. The office itself did not. There were no leases, no employee rosters, no contracts, no utility bills, and no trace that the office had ever physically occupied any building in Washington. Late Tuesday afternoon, an email appeared in my inbox without a sender or subject line. It contained a single scanned memorandum dated March 18th, 1946. Across the page, someone had typed, "Office 7 remains essential. Do not alter appropriation." There was no signature or agency seal, only a handwritten note in blue ink beneath the typed message. It said, "It is cheaper to keep them asleep." Assuming it was some elaborate prank, I checked the document metadata. The scan had been created less than an hour earlier on a government scanner. The following morning, my security badge failed when I attempted to enter the Capitol Annex sub-basement archives. The security guard frowned at his monitor and told me the system showed that I had already been down there that morning. I explained that I had only just arrived. He stared at the screen for another moment, before forcing a smile and calling it a glitch. That evening, I reviewed my access history. According to the log, someone using my credentials had entered the archive 2 minutes before I had even parked my car. When I requested surveillance footage, the request was denied because, according to the official response, no recording existed. That night, another anonymous email arrived. It contained only one sentence. "You're looking in the budgets. Start looking at the buildings." Attached was a list of federal properties. Every address had been demolished decades earlier, except the last, a warehouse outside Alexandria, Virginia. Official records identified it as an abandoned General Services Administration storage facility that had been vacant since 1978. I drove there on Saturday morning. The warehouse appeared deserted. Rust covered the chain-link fencing. Weeds had overtaken the parking lot, and every window was boarded shut. Yet fresh tire tracks led through the gate, whose lock had clearly been replaced only recently. Inside, I found nothing except dust-covered shelving, empty concrete floors, and, in the exact center of the building, a single freight elevator. It had no buttons, no inspection certificate, and no controls of any kind. Mounted beside its doors was a polished brass plaque bearing only 2 words, "Office 7." Before I could touch the doors, they slid open. The elevator descended without any input from me. It passed one level, then another, then another. The indicator continued downward far longer than any ordinary basement should have allowed. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into a hallway, lined with filing cabinets, stretching so far into the darkness that I could not see where they ended. Every cabinet bore a single year. They began with 1776 and continued uninterrupted toward the present. I opened one at random. Inside rested a single folder labeled United States. Continued. Another cabinet contained a folder labeled United States. Terminated. A third read, Revision 14. I removed one dated 1962. It described a version of history in which the Cuban Missile Crisis ended in full nuclear exchange. Tens of millions died. The federal government collapsed, and the document ended with a single red stamp across the final page. Rejected. Another folder described an influenza pandemic that lasted 11 years. It had been rejected. Another chronicled a Great Depression that never ended. Rejected. Another began with the attacks of September 11th, before spiraling into a month of coordinated attacks that erased half the federal government. Rejected. Every folder described a different America. Every catastrophe had unfolded. Every future had existed. Every one had been discarded. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a calm voice spoke from somewhere behind me. "You finally found us." I turned and saw an elderly man standing several feet away. He wore a plain gray suit with no badge, no insignia, and nothing that identified his position or authority. The only thing pinned to his jacket was a simple visitor sticker bearing the words Office 7. There was something unsettling about him, not because he looked threatening, but because he looked completely ordinary, as though he had spent an entire lifetime ensuring that no one would ever remember his face. I told him that I did not understand. He gave me a faint smile and said that I understood budgets. Then he gestured toward the endless rows of filing cabinets, stretching into the darkness behind him, and explained that Congress believed it was funding another administrative office. In reality, it was funding the people responsible for deciding which version of history continued. I laughed, though even I could hear how hollow it sounded, and told him that what he was describing was impossible. He replied that appropriating the same office every year for nearly a century, without anyone asking why should have been impossible too. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words never came. My mind drifted back to a committee markup meeting several weeks earlier. During the session, one amendment had proposed eliminating less than $1 million from an obscure administrative account as a routine cost-saving measure. It had not sparked debate. No one had defended it. Yet when the final version of the bill was released, the amendment had vanished without explanation. At the time, none of us had thought twice about it. The old man nodded as though he had been watching the memory unfold inside my head, and said they had never come that close before. I asked what happened if Office 7 lost its funding. For the first time since we met, his expression changed. He looked past me toward the endless cabinets lining the hallway, and said they would stop rejecting histories. The words hung in the silence between us. Then somewhere deep within the archive, a metallic clang echoed through the darkness. One filing cabinet had opened. A second followed moments later. Then another. Within seconds, the sound spread throughout the archive until hundreds of steel drawers were sliding open one after another, each impact echoing like distant thunder beneath the earth. The old man turned toward the sound, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his face. He said they had noticed I was there. I asked who he meant, but he did not answer. Instead, he stepped to one of the cabinets, removed a thin folder, and placed it into my hands. Across the tab were two simple words: current continuity. Inside were only 3 pages. The first described that day's events with impossible precision, matching everything that had already happened down to the minute. The second outlined the following day, including meetings that had not yet been announced, and votes that had not yet taken place. The third page stopped halfway through a sentence. At the bottom of the unfinished page, written in fresh black ink that had not fully dried, was a single notation: continuing resolution failed. Revision pending. Before I could ask what it meant, every light in the archive flickered once. The sound of turning pages began somewhere beyond the nearest row of cabinets. It spread rapidly through the darkness until it surrounded us from every direction. Tens of thousands of pages were turning at once, as though an unseen force had begun searching through every version of history ever recorded. The old man slowly closed his eyes and said they had started looking for the next one, I looked down at the folder in my hands. When I raised my eyes again, the old man was gone. Only the endless sound of turning pages remained.
Transmission complete. Archive updated. Relay connection terminated. Signal lost.